Welcome back to another episode of Book Eaters. On this episode, we're going to talk about White Fragility, a book that we started reading mostly because April was reading it and made us all. April, when you first talked about how we should read this book and do a podcast about it, I was really hesitant, mostly because I didn't want to upset anyone. I didn't want to offend people. I didn't want to say the wrong thing, and I didn't want to address it myself personally, and it makes me very uncomfortable. But then you said that if it makes us uncomfortable, we should definitely do it and proceed forward. Did you have any hesitation at all, or?
I did, mostly because one of the things the book made me think about was lack of diversity in my own friend group. And reading this book I had a lot of things that I wanted to discuss. And it made me realize that the only people I have to discuss it with are other people who probably have the same experiences and perspectives that I do. But I didn't, so that's why I hesitated. But I didn't want it to be what kept me from learning and, becoming a better person. So rather than let it stop me, I was like, let's just dive in. What's the worst that can happen?
Yeah, right. What's the worst that can happen? What about you, Iris? Did you have any concerns with reading this book and pledging forward with doing a podcast about it, or did you just immediately go, yeah, I'm in?
The only hesitation I had was, this is another white woman talking about, colored people's perspective. So I was a little nervous reading it, but that was because I didn't understand the term white fragility. So now that I have a better understanding, I understand where she's coming from.
I grew up on the Southwest, Arizona. My family is very military, so we were on military bases, which is a different sort of demographic than most places. There's only one high school, which means everybody went to the same high school. So some of the things that were mentioned in the book may not have struck as much with me, but they still did, right? But I recently we all do this thing called GISH, and we did summer 24 hours GISH, and they had an emphasis on this topic. And so we went to a seminar, and there was a gentleman in the seminar who said that people don't change their racism, or they behave out of what is their biggest fear. And I did a lot of thinking about what my biggest fear is, and my biggest fear is that I don't want to be the bad guy. And I thought even deeper about that. Is it that I don't want to be seen as the bad guy, or is it that I don't actually want to be the bad guy? And it's that I don't want to be the bad guy. I'm perfectly happy to martyr myself if it means I'm not the bad guy, but I can't be the bad guy. Like, that's a fear I have. I don't know where it comes from or what it is. And so facing things that make me the bad guy are hard. And so I was nervous about reading the book because I knew that it was gonna make me the bad guy, and then I was gonna have to face that and change that, and but it was gonna realize my worst fears. And so that's kind of where I came from. My perspective was coming from. My intention was a little bit protective of myself and my ego, and that's where I started when I started reading this book and when we started talking about doing this podcast. What about you, April? Where does your perspective and intention came from with regard to this book?
I think I'm still trying to figure it out. I think there is an element of not wanting to be the bad guy too, because I live my life very intentionally. I always, watch these movies or read a book, or even people that I know, and they have no problem being the bad guy. People who don't mind complaining to the manager, or sending their food back, or writing a bad Google review. I can't even do that, So for people who can do that, it's just sort of a mystery to me. I can't imagine being able to let go of that sort of concern for whether or not you're being troublesome to other people, But also, I think where my perspective is a little bit different is, I don't know if it's come across in the podcast or not, but I'm Southern, grew up in the South, My family is Southern for as far back as I can trace. So it's a very deeply ingrained part of my identity. And frankly, not always an identity that I take pride in, which is unusual in the South. And people that I love and respect and are part of my family, or that I grew up with since I was a little person and are otherwise really great people, have a very hard time either admitting that racism is a problem or are still pretty racist. And it's been very hard for me to reconcile those two parts of people that otherwise I wouldn't have a problem with, you know? And why is it so hard to talk about? And that's why I felt like I started with this book, is because I feel like more and more in my own life, the people from that part of my life, I'm growing more and more distant from, because I feel like there's no common ground anymore. And so it's all very superficial conversations at holidays and other family events. And I don't want to regret not having real relationships with those people. But how can you if you can't talk about things that matter? And so that's kind of where I started with it.
Iris, you definitely have a different perspective than April and I from previous conversations we've had about this. Did you want to elaborate at all on what your intention was, or additional perspectives, maybe background about where you come from, or your experiences in Hawaii maybe that are different than ours, being from the South and from the West Coast?
Well, I'm not Hawaiian, but
Well, you lived in Hawaii, right?
I do have Polynesian blood in me. It's just not Hawaiian. Growing up there, it was nice. We were family. And I could walk down the street or go anywhere and hugs are given. And the color, I never understood that. I was not aware of that difference, really. You read about it and you're like, oh, okay. It's just stories of then. And then when I came in my middle school and started experiencing what, because I'm different. I've had people come up to me and say, what are you? Because they wanted to classify me and they didn't understand how to classify me. Because I did look Asian and I was brown. And so they were trying to understand where can I put this person in my mind, and it was a hard transition. It really was a hard transition. It was like, wow, this is actually still here. Even down to my friends. There were social gatherings that I was excluded because parents or because, and things of that nature. But the odd thing about it, because I'm not Black, but I am brown, I'm like in the middle there. I didn't really fit anywhere, and it was hard, except for my own, And because my parents were educated and because they were both engineers, we were in a neighborhoods that were predominantly white, and so it was hard at times. It really, really, really was difficult, even down to dating. you know, my experience in college, I was dating a German, full-blooded. His parents just came to the United States from Germany, and he's first generation born. And he had a hard time dating me. Eventually we had to stop. So yeah, and then moving back home was nice. Growing up, that's a lot of pressure. And me being brown, I can't even imagine, being Black, but it was stressful. And then moving back to Hawaii, that stress lifted. Oh my God. It was like night and day. I was like, I felt I'm home. Because I was those work, it was that Blackness. Nobody saw the color. We just accepted each other, and it was just home. It was different. And then at that point, I understood why there were still people in Hawaii that were angry at what happened. when the United States came over and wanting to separate from the U.S. I mean, before moving to the mainland, I didn't understand it, but after moving to the mainland and coming back, I totally got it. Totally did. And but this book, my intention was to understand that, because there's still struggles I have. I mean, I had it in the West Coast, thinking, and it's supposed to be progressive there, and and it's just everywhere. I mean, my kids saw it in Florida, very different mindset. I mean, yeah, but was, but I do, I wanted to understand a different perspective. That's my intention, was to understand, another person's perspective that, I mean, these are conversations, honestly, I've never had with none of my white friends, okay? Honestly.
Yeah.
So I wanted to understand that a little bit. I mean, and it's my fault, truly, because I never had the courage to ask, because that's a touchy subject and not everybody likes talking about it. I mean, I can tell you experiences that I've had discussing on my own racial experiences with cops alone, you know,
Yeah.
and how they react. Oh, you're just overreacting, and as soon as that happens, I'm like, okay, shut down. No, we can't talk, you know, because I mean, that's obviously they're not wanting to listen to you. I mean, that's already, so it's
Yeah.
hard. So I just wanted to see what she had to say about it. So from her perspective, as a white woman,
Yeah. So we thought that it would be a good idea before beginning a conversation about actually the content in the book to talk about the actual definitions that she put up with different words in the books and what they meant in the context of the book, because many of these words are loaded.
One of the things that I've noticed on social media, a lot of times people shut down immediately when they hear certain terms. When they hear white privilege, that's it. You're not going to get any further in the discussion, because privilege to them means that you had it easy. And they have a million, different backgrounds to explain how they struggled and they had a lot to overcome, and everything that they have in life they had to, earn.
Right.
And so you're never going to get anywhere with them, because they think you're telling them that they haven't had to struggle. And it also talks about racial stress. And I think, and this might be one of the first times we're testing the waters on Frank Talk here, but and this, Iris, I think you'll have an interesting perspective on this, because the book talks about racial stress and how white people don't really have to question or think about their race very often, because as they're going through life, they're represented on TV, in the media, people in authority. So when you think about race, you don't think white, you think black and brown people, right? If there's a racial problem, you don't think there's a problem amongst the white people, right? So white people are able to move about without really considering their own race most of the time, and are probably pretty happy to continue to do so. Whereas black people and other people of color don't have that same freedom of movement. They are always aware of their otherness. But Iris, listening to you talk about growing up in Hawaii, do you think part of the reason why you struggled so much when you came over to the mainland is because maybe even more so than Michelle and I, you did grow up in a very racially unstressed environment? We were aware of race, whereas you got to grow up in your formative years not thinking about race at all.
Okay, your question is whether it was doubled, the stress was doubled because I came from a non-stress. Initially,
Right.
yes, from 10 till college, it was a struggle. But then coming back the second time, it wasn't a struggle. It still was
So
there.
so that actually works out really good with the definition of the book, because when you first came and had never dealt with racial stress, it was extremely difficult for you and traumatic, but you acclimated yourself pretty quickly. And when you came back the second time, you weren't as fragile, and therefore, was able to adapt and was a lot stronger for it. Whereas white people in the book anyway, and I would say certainly in my own experience, don't have our race questioned, and so we don't have to deal with the feeling uncomfortable about our race very often. And if we are put in situations where, like the author used an example where she went to the retirement party and there were two parties going on, and one party was almost all Black people were at the party, and she wasn't sure which group was her friend's party, and she was uncomfortable going into, the party that was mostly Black, whereas white people rarely have to do that, and they usually can opt out of it because it's a social thing, whereas Black people don't have that. A lot of the functions that they go to, they have to be one of the few Black people in the room.
It's funny because that's a true statement in April. But the other way around for me is I even to this day, if when I walk into a room and it's mostly white people, and especially when it's mostly male only white people, okay, the stress level goes up in me.
Yeah, and I think especially something that has been part of our identity, and we're all, middle-aged now, it's going to be very hard for that not to be there, but I think recognizing it is half the battle, because once you see it for what it is, then you don't have to necessarily react instinctively to it. You can choose your reaction to it,
Right.
So one of the other words is privilege. Of course, I know that is a huge trigger for some people. So when the white privilege is mentioned, it's not necessarily saying that you haven't struggled, that you haven't had obstacles that you've had to overcome. It's saying that your race wasn't one of those things. And that's white privilege, the lens through which our institutions judge you, which brings up what actually the definition of racism is in the book, which I think is very controversial. But in the context of the book, there's prejudice, which is just kind of biases and preconceived ideas based off of random information that you collect throughout your life about a certain group of people. And everyone is guilty of that, because there's no way to go through life without collecting information and sorting it, making assumptions based off of it. That's how the human brain works. You can't turn it off. So anyone who says they're not prejudiced is not being honest with themselves or with other people. So
100%.
Yeah, so I think we all agree with that. And then the next level up is when you treat people differently or do something negative based off of those biases, then that's discrimination, and everyone can act in a discriminatory manner towards people. But racism in the book is defined as only something white people can be guilty of and are automatically guilty of, because our system of government, basically all of our institutions and powers are ruled by white people. And because of that, only white people can be racist, because only white people have the power to control other people's lives through our systems and institutions. And we've kind of touched on it already. White supremacy is not the same as white nationalists, these hate groups that, form and believe that the white race is better than any other race, the Aryan Nation type white supremacist. KKK is what most people consider as white supremacy. And the book's argument is that white supremacy is actually, pervasive throughout American culture, because white people are those people that are in positions of authority and positions of power to enact laws and regulate things that benefit them at the cost of other races and ethnicities. So that's what's meant in the book as white supremacy, is not that white people think they're better than everyone, but white people are in positions of power and authority to create a system that benefits them. But the term white supremacy, I think, is just automatically going to, close people's minds, and they won't really consider the principle behind it, which is worth considering. Which is why I almost wish that there were new words, instead of using words that people already have a preconceived idea of what they mean. So maybe some linguists could get on that, and I think
We
we
need
would
some
all.
new terminology for sure. It's very loaded.
Well, I think that covers the main problematic terms.
What do you guys think nurtures white fragility? What do you have
Well,
any?
it's definitely got to be, to use the term of the book, white supremacy, right?
Right.
The whole, even, which I'm sure everybody who's listening has at least done some research into this, or they wouldn't be listening. But the whole, redlining of neighborhoods, and people are able to live very insulated so that they're not having to confront people that are that different from themselves very often. White solidarity, that whole thing of being uncomfortable and avoiding that discomfort. I think
Yeah,
all of that contributes to it.
I think in a lot of ways, yeah, I'm guilty of nurturing white fragility in that I don't like conflict. I don't like people to feel like badly
Right.
ever. I want everyone to be comfortable and relaxed. And so a lot of times what that looks like is when someone brings up something, I try and manage it in a way that minimizes the actual concern so that we can move forward without having to address it. And I think in doing that, what I'm doing is actually protecting the person who said something to someone that wasn't cool or said something that wasn't appropriate, rather than protecting the person whose feelings were actually hurt, or who was impacted by that uh, comment. And I think I do it most of all because I know that the white person that did the thing, I know that they didn't mean to. That wasn't their intent. That they didn't in any way want to hurt the person that they said it to. So I immediately try and protect them from themselves. But by doing so, I'm hurting the person who's been impacted by it. I think that I see that, and I've been basically mirroring other people who do the same thing. So I see other people do that. I see them handle it. I see that it's a conflict-free resolution and that we're able to move forward and things are able to get done. And so I take it as a good way to manage it, but it clearly is not.
Yeah, I think for me, in my personal life, right, the personal friendships that I've cultivated, like with you guys, and the friendships that I've made over the last few years since moving out of my small town, I don't really have to confront that too often, because I wouldn't be friends with a racist, an overt racist, I should say. Also, the more subtle forms of racism I'm still learning about, so I may not even recognize it when someone else does it. I have been in situations, obviously, with family members, and I don't always speak out, although my family would disagree and probably say I'm, a little aggressive with calling people out. But there's a whole element of keeping the peace in your family. Don't talk politics or religion. And as long as we do that, we'll be fine. But I don't necessarily think race is political. That troubles me, that people see it as a political issue. It shouldn't be. It should be a people issue. I guess I feel like I'm already sort of the black sheep of my family, and kind of on the outside, I hesitate to do anything that would further that more. And when I see it in colleagues at work, I hesitate because I don't want to do something that could damage my work relationships, whether it may not necessarily impede my advancement, but it would affect cooperation at work and teamwork at work. Obviously, I'm in a position now, not, I haven't always been, but I am in a position of leadership now, and I certainly would not tolerate that from anyone who reports to me. But if it's not in my chain of command underneath me, I have a lot more would I be able to call my boss out? Not that my boss is racist, let me make that clear. But if my boss was racist, would I be able to question it? I don't know.
I think, and this is something, how would I want it to be handled if the comment was about me, right? Which does happen, right? It happens to all three of us, I'm sure. That there are times when there are judgments made about us because we're women, and how we want people to stand up for us, or how we need that to happen in the room. And a lot of times, especially in work situations, right, it's where we have to support one another, where like if we see another woman being minimized, we have to stand up for them and say, oh, what were your thoughts? And or if they give an idea and then someone else gives the idea and then their idea gets pushed down, you have to say, hey, that was so and so's idea. I think that those kinds of things happen to people of color probably more often than they happen to women versus men, and that's another area where we can, in the same way, do it. I guess I don't know if it's always just about shutting a specific. I don't know. I mean, I don't know, but like, how would you want it to be handled?
In the past, you had old fairy tales that put women in a lesser position dependent on men, okay? And we would tell those fairy tales to our children. So it ingrains thoughts in men and ingrains a way of thinking about the girls themselves and their position in society. And so then all of a sudden, the realization that, hey, we are teaching our kids, we're seeing that the sexual disparity, but we're actually promoting it because of the stories and how we're relaying this information from the kids since they're small. So like for myself, I never told my daughter or my son, I always had the politically correct fairy tales, one where it shows a female taking on her own stance, and the equality between a man and a woman and things of that nature, to hopefully start teaching kids at a young age. And I think the same thing needs to be done, being able to communicate as as a family unit openly, uh, about our weaknesses, to open up and saying this is not as bad as it, this is not, we shouldn't make it the taboo. What is it that people say, you know um, when you talk or say something, you give it, you say a name or something, you give it power, so you shouldn't do it, you should stay quiet. I think that's a mistake. I think we need to have the ability to talk about it and then not give it power. I think keeping quiet in itself gives it power. And,
I agree with that.
I think so too. I mean, especially you're talking about the stories and books. Like, I don't remember ever reading any stories or books with characters that weren't white,
yeah, exactly.
until maybe the last 3 or 4 years. Like, we've read, there's more available for me in my reading level, but I don't know if there are for kids at a lower
Oh,
level.
you're absolutely
Yeah.
right.
You can be a good person and still have racist behaviors. And you don't have to feel, and I hear that a lot too, is like, I don't want, everybody wants to vilify the white person, you know, white guilt. Why do I don't need to feel guilty because I'm white? I don't think people have to feel guilty because they're white either, but you should feel guilty if you're not owning your own behaviors and trying to learn and connect with people different from you, you know?
So I think that that's the main thing that Robin DiAngelo does in the book, is she takes this premise that racism equals you're a bad person and moves it to instead say you're a bad person if you can't admit and address your racism. And she does this by systematically showing us examples of people not being able to accept their own racism, even though they've requested to not change that, systematically throughout the book. She takes it over and over again. She shows us an example of what racism is. She tells us an example of a person who commits that racism, and then immediately shows us an example of how they did not handle it correctly and how
Yes.
they should have handled it. Like, that is the way that the book is framed. And by doing that, what she does is um, make me feel like, okay, so I'm not a bad person. I'm not the bad guy, or I was the bad guy, but this is my redemption arc. This is how I can do it. Instead of being the bad guy that does racist stuff all the time, I'm now the good guy who is addressing my racism proactively and constructively, and the bad guys are now the people who are not doing
No,
that.
no, 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 no. I see, that's where I'm not comfortable with good bad binary. That's why I
Okay.
was going into what I was saying before. I think, to me, classifying good and bad. I mean, everyone, I think we all have our good and bad sides, and
Sure.
trying to say, oh, okay, I just did this to just clear out my bad side. I'm not. I grew up in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
It's either you're honest with yourself, and
Right.
then or you're false. Okay, and if you're honest with yourself, you realize when you understand the intention of why you did what you did, and come to terms with it, and then learn from it, and you evolve as a person
Right.
once you start realizing all your actions, and you actually take an honest approach to all, those are your intentions, honestly,
Mm-hmm.
and not try to, instead of saying, oh, I'm a good person now for doing that. I think that
Well, I mean that.
classification,
Right.
I think in itself is harmful,
Well, I
Yeah,
think
I
because
that's
think
what
it's. I
Michelle
think
was
it is
saying
a
too.
little. I think it's a little problematic. I wasn't saying that it's
oh, no,
the
no, no,
right
not
approach.
you, I'm
I'm
saying
just
what
saying
she
that
said,
that was the
sorry.
approach that I felt like that was one of the ways I felt inauthentic reading the book is basically what I was saying. So I agree with you, right?
No,
Yeah.
I meant
That
her, I meant the author, not you, sorry.
oh, okay. But I
I
mean,
meant,
yeah, so it feels a little inauthentic the way that
yeah.
that was positioned and it may have been
You,
unintentional, but that's
you know
how
what
I
I think
felt
it would.
at times.
I think that the reason why she framed it that way is, I would say, on a scale of white people, Michelle and I are maybe a little less fragile, as evidenced by our willingness to discuss these things. I think the author is used to dealing with people higher on that fragility scale, and so she framed the book that way, probably based off of her 20 plus years of working in diversity training and encountering
Yeah.
those people.
No, I mean, for sure there were a lot of tactics that she used, such as whenever she would talk about a racist example, sometimes she would use a random person and sometimes she would talk about her own personal times that when she would say, I do this. And that's another way in which she was able to say, look, I'm saying that I do
I'm
it
one of you
too.
too. Yeah.
I'm not as, and I actually appreciated that because even though you think that I'm not very fragile, every single one of these times when she would bring it up, any I could think of a time when I did that thing. Not, oh, sure, I know I've done it. Like a specific example of a time when I had done that to someone else. I could think of it every single time.
Right.
And every single time, my immediate response was to try to justify it, try to smooth it over, try to make it okay, because that's how cognitive dissonance works in your head. That's how you manage it. Like that's how you are able to get up in the morning after you've done something. So it was I I need to be treated sometimes with kid gloves, at least in the initially, I think. I needed
Right.
it in order to be able to really see myself, in those specific situations as someone who is not living up to my full potential as a human being.
Well,
I
I think that's what I appreciated about the book too, is because this is a woman who has studied race,
Right.
has worked in the field, is one of the most educated people on the topic, and if she can still screw up, then it makes yourself be like, okay, I don't have this standard where I have to be perfect, Um, and she
and
did have very specific examples of even recent examples of where she screwed up. And so she's also modeling that behavior of being able to call yourself out.
Yeah.
So I didn't, there was a lot of with the book that I didn't necessarily agree with or didn't resonate with me, but I did appreciate the author. And I think and
Sure.
the good bad binary, I think, is important because people that I have experience with are the typical, Southern conservative Christians. And
Hmm.
because they're Christians, they can't be bad, right?
Right.
And so I think that's why the good bad
I mean,
binary
whoa.
is important to address is that you can be a good person, a good God loving, church going, uh, charity given person, and still have problematic behaviors that you maybe want to look at and work on if you truly want to become a better person. The other parts of the white fragility that I think was interesting and found to be very valid was all the ways that white people try to exempt themselves from having the discussion about racism. They want to be like, well, I'm not part of the problem, so I'm opting out of this. And color blindness, Iris has already kind of sort of brought up, is definitely part of that. And there were a few other examples in the book. So you want to kind of dive into those? Well, I think one of them, well, let's talk about color blindness. I think that's probably a big one now because you hear people say that a lot, like, oh, I don't see race. And
I mean, I feel like people have shut that down. Don't you see a lot of shutting of that down now?
I see attempts at it, but are people really absorbing it? I don't know.
Yeah, that's a true
Because they
statement.
don't think
Yeah.
because no, in fact I know it's not, because I even today I was reading comments where they were like saying that that's the problem, is that we shouldn't be seeing race. You know, people are just people and we shouldn't see race. And I think one of the best examples in the book that the author used is when they were in some kind of a work group and there was, you know, a black facilitator working with a group, and one person said that, you know, I don't see race, and the facilitator was like, well, then how do you recognize racism? You know, that's such a huge component of it. If you're not able to see that this interaction is between a person of color and a white person, and the white person is behaving problematically, how can you recognize it as racism instead of just one person being mean? So if you're not paying attention to race, which is, first of all, not true. No one is completely unaware that this person that I'm speaking to is a different color than me. You know, you recognize their hair color, you know, you recognize what they're wearing, you're going to recognize their race.
Do you think that that's a little bit where the all lives matter nonsense comes from? From this idea that we shouldn't see race?
And I think it's definitely a reaction from the phase one of racism, of
right.
Treat everyone the same, everyone is equal, judge them on the content of their character. All of that is too easy, though. It's too easy just to say, hey, I'm not going to judge people on their race, i.e., I'm just not going to see race at all. The real challenge is see someone's race, recognize that race, see that is a black person, that is a Hispanic person, and not have negative things come back to you because of that. So it's not, that's a Hispanic person is no different than saying that's a person has curly hair, or so that person is short.
It's funny that you bring that up, because I don't know if you guys remember that part in the book where she's talking about how the child was like, that man's black. And how the mother was like, quiet. You know? And I feel like I spent a little bit of time with that, like, how would I behave? And I think that I don't know how to behave the way that she wants me to. Like, I don't know how to go, yeah, he's black. Like I couldn't, like, it was hard for me to get to that space. Did you struggle with that too? Or did you just immediately go, yeah, I should just be like, cool, he's black. It's another thing that's happening. But it's kind of
no, I would say even worse, more than that, I recognize myself doing that. Like when she talks about people who, when they say black, they say it in a lower voice. I've definitely done that. And I know that I've done it because I'm worried that if people hear me say someone's race, they're going to assume that I'm saying it in a negative way. Yeah. But that made me think it shouldn't be anything negative to recognize someone's race. And until we start saying it, you know, without making a big deal out of it, it's not going to be normalized. And so the more we do it,
I
the better.
I agree there.
Yeah. It makes me so uncomfortable. And I think that this comes a lot into, you know, the idea of our racial stamina. Like, my racial stamina is just not very high yet. And I need to work on that a little bit. And this is an area where I guess I could work on that. But it's hard for me to say.
It's not natural. It's because we've been told that to see someone's race is bad. We've been told that.
And then when I hear other people do it, like, I want to, like if when Rob talks about someone, he's like, you know, the Mexican guy, like, I get very upset about that. Like, oh, but why am I so upset about that?
Exactly.
And he doesn't understand it either. He's like, how would you like me to describe him? Especially since I have face blindness and I have difficulty remembering what people look like, you know, like, it's hard to describe people to me. So, like, but it's, I struggle with it all of the time. And when she told me that story and the whole colorblind, like, we sort of perpetuate it. But I don't know. I don't know if I don't know.
It's a delicate thing
it's
because
hard.
on the one hand, intellectually, we know that the only way to destigmatize talking and seeing someone's race as a positive thing, right? To be able to do that, to be able to talk about race and assume that you're referring to someone's race in a positive way, you have to start doing it more to make it more normalized. But knowing that the majority of people are not going to hear it the way that you're intending, the majority of people are going to have our first reaction.
Yeah,
It
but
makes it takes it. It'd be a huge act of bravery, and I don't know if I have it, to be honest.
yeah, but the thing is the intent. Why are you saying the word black? If is it mean? Are you trying to be? If you're not, then there's nothing. What you're saying is.
Well, it's basically like when you're like say I'm at work and we're talking about, oh, do you know James, and you're like, I know three James. Which James are you talking about? Well, I want to say the black James, but I can't
How
because
how would you
I'm
describe me in
worried.
a group?
Right? You know what I
You,
mean?
I mean, I don't. It's hard because I am the same way. I don't want to use someone's race as a way to describe them, like as if I feel like because I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't say April's the white one. I wouldn't say that.
But no, would you?
You know what I
Think
mean?
about it.
I wouldn't say like which April you're talking about. The April, the white April. Like I wouldn't say that. I would say, your last name or I don't know what I would say, but we don't describe white people like that. So it feels wrong to describe people of other colors the same way, or people of other countries of origin, or it just feels
Well,
weird.
yeah,
Like
I would
I
like
shouldn't
to
say it.
think that we could get to the point where I used to work with somebody and then we had, two mics, right? And one was little Mike and one was big Mike, right? Can we get where race is just such a natural thing to say about someone without any emotional or judgment tied to it, that we could just say, oh, black, white, white Mike.
Well,
I
you'll
don't
say
know.
you could
I
say I've seen it. I've seen people do it in a way without saying their actual skin color, and it's especially when you have someone who's a white person who has blonde hair or dirty blonde hair. Oh, the dirty blonde one and the black haired one. I mean, you are saying a color, but it's just in a
Hair color.
roundabout
right,
way.
but
But
even
is
when it
that is
starts to
that
get
authentic? Is
ridiculous.
that honest? And is it hurtful? Or is it more hurtful to say it? Like I want to do the least hurtful thing. Do you know what I mean? I want to be the most kind that I can. I want to I don't I don't I don't know how to do it. I don't know how to navigate that, and I don't know. And maybe
Well, I mean,
there's a
knowing
book
you,
on it I
Michelle,
can
I
read.
feel like you would be an example of a person who should be able to just say that Mexican person or that black person because
We know you.
we
Yeah.
know you, and it's not a judgment. But
Right.
other people who don't know you might
Also,
assume that it is a judgment.
I
So
also
that's what.
don't have a really accurate way of telling what kind of person someone is.
Oh no,
You
yeah,
know what I
that's a
mean?
whole
Like
nother problematic.
because just because someone looks black doesn't mean that they identify as black. Maybe they identify as Puerto Rican or
Yeah.
or
Well,
Panamanian, and
I
I
can
don't
tell
if
you.
you say that
No, that's
the
true.
person like
Yeah.
if I say someone is Mexican and they're really Puerto Rican, that's a that's an insult. People don't like that. And
Well, I can
Oh,
tell you,
I
I
could
got
tell you.
myself into trouble doing that myself when I thought I was being, sensitive by referring to someone as African American and
and
they
they
were
weren't there.
Jamaican. And I
Oh,
was
Okay.
like, oh, sorry.
Yeah. So this is even within colored people. I was a group of us, all brown, but different types of brown. You had Guatemala, me, coming from the islands, and then someone whose skin color was brown, but she's from. I hope she never listens to this. Portugal. And so
Portugal.
yeah, Portugal. And so we were like, he goes and says, oh, all us brown people together. And she goes, I'm white, right
I
there.
mean, if you identify that way, then
And
that's how
that's
you
exactly right. She took to offense that she was called brown. Okay. But I mean, I was taken aback by that. I was like, okay, sorry. I mean, he too. He was like, okay.
identify.
wow, wow.
But
I mean,
that's how you identify yourself. That's fine.
but you
It does
can't
happen.
know how,
I agree with exactly what you're saying, Michelle. You're absolutely
if
right.
I don't know how they identify, then misidentifying them feels it's as wrong as if I said that someone was a man when they were a woman, or when they identify as a woman and I call them, you know what I mean? Like that also is wrong on the same sort of context. But if there isn't I don't have the answers. I don't know what to do.
I don't think there are answers right now. I think the climate that we are living in is going to decide those answers. And those answers may be really bad if people aren't working to make sure that they end up being good, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, the answer could be nope, you're not allowed to refer to anyone's race at any time. And I hope that we don't end up in that type of
No, I think
culture,
what it is
you know?
I think, April, you're
Because it
right.
should be
I
celebrated.
well, I agree, and I think the point here is, and Michelle, you're absolutely right. In this time, in this, in our time right now, you're right. It's hard to call someone out that they may not like. It's because there's a stigma that goes along with that color.
Right.
But hopefully, as April is saying, is over time when that doesn't no longer a stigma, then they won't feel slighted if you call them brown or black or whatever other color.
Right.
That 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 doesn't.
Well, I mean,
And it's
I don't.
because there is a stigma right now. So
I think that some of it is stigma and some of it is just we want to be who we are and we want to be where we're from and people are proud of their heritage and their culture and you don't want to take that from them, even if
But I
they're not
think
present.
if everyone agrees that we want to get to the point where race can be referred to and normalized as a comment meant to be either neutral, like, you know, someone's hair color, or if not, you know, celebratory. If we want to get to that point, then we have to have a lot of discussion. Everyone has to participate. No one can exempt themselves. And we're in like this state of flux right now where that actually could happen. We could be in the middle of a cultural and societal shift in America where it becomes okay to see people's race and not have that as another descriptor of being racist, to be able to see someone's race as a good thing and not necessarily as a way that you're judging someone. But if we shy away from it and everybody just wants to go back to the way it was because we don't have this racial stamina built up to where we can have these discussions, and everyone just puts their head back in the sand and they're too nervous about saying the wrong thing, they're too nervous about putting themselves in a position where they're going to be corrected, too nervous about someone judging them, and too afraid to make those mistakes, then we're going to go right back to where it was, and this will happen over and
Yeah,
over and over again.
she doesn't really address that in the book. I mean, she talks about that example and about how we should be proud of what you're saying, but she does not addressing the full scope of the conversation we're having, I don't think, in the book. So maybe
Right.
she'll do a follow-up,
Well,
or maybe
I think
there's another book out there by a person of color who can address it.
I was going to bring that up at the end. This is one book, you know.
Right.
There's a lot more out there. But anyway,
Yeah,
so to get back to, I just wanted to bring up a couple of other of the exemptions that were covered in the book that I felt like were important. So colorblindness is a huge one, but also the individualism, where people think, it goes back to that example of, oh, well, I was the only white person in my neighborhood, so therefore, you know, I didn't have white privilege, and my experience was different from everyone else's. Or I grew up in Germany, so how could I be part of American racism? Yes, there are, and I think the book is right about this. The author is right about this. Everyone is going to have a unique experience in life. That if you focused on one person, yes, they have things that set them apart, and they don't follow this pattern of white privilege racism. But we don't function as a society that way. You can't say, well, my experience was different. You have to look at how society is functioning, because focusing on yourself means that society will never change. The second thing that I think she brings up that's important is the meritocracy, which is people do well and succeed in life on their own merit. But what that fails to recognize is that race is a huge obstacle for that. Like, for example, I know that, you know, I grew up poor, I got pregnant young. Yes, I worked incredibly hard and I did make sacrifices and pulled myself out of that hole, right?
Right.
But had I, and it was hard. It was extremely hard. If I had to deal with my race on top of all of that, would I have gotten as far as I did? I don't know. I don't know, because I was never tested in that way.
Right.
It's just an unfair analogy. If anything, the fact that you had to struggle to make it should make you more sympathetic to people who are going through that struggle, wouldn't you think?
Yeah, I think, though, a lot of times what happens is people view successfulness as a pie, and there's only so many slices of that pie. And if um, someone else takes a slice of that pie, then that's less for us. So if we work really hard to get somewhere, then everyone else needs to work just as hard. People don't want to lose their advantage. I think that that's what that's primarily out. But I think it is harder.
Oh, it
Like,
is harder.
I mean, I think that it is harder for people. And I think that if you have two candidates and they're identical, and one of them is a person of color, you can pretty much guarantee the person had to work harder than the white person to get to the same qualifications, right? Like that in
Oh,
hundreds of ways. It's
I've
harder.
had it happen to me. Being a woman of color, I was in a company that I'm not going to name, um, that had white authority that respected me and were pushing me. And you had one person who resented me. He actually took me out to lunch and told me, I'm going to do all that I can to get you fired. I don't like you.
Wow.
Yeah.
I hope
Because
And you know what it is to have that stress, to know that this person of power could, hurt me. And
why
that's,
didn't he like you? Did he say?
no, he didn't. I don't know. I'm assuming it's because I was a woman and because I'm a woman of color. Because if you look at the demographics of the office, I
Yeah.
was the only female engineer.
But what did you say?
I
I mean,
didn't say,
I hope he at least waited until after the salad course. Pretty awkward lunch
That
there.
guy sounds like
oh,
such
he did.
a
He
dick.
did. He waited to the end. Um, and I
But
just
that's
I said, thank you
weird.
for lunch. And I just left. I didn't give him any accountability. And then from that point, I strived to make sure I did my best. Okay. And then things became so awkward that I had to leave. I couldn't, it was a stressful situation.
If you could go back, how do you think you would handle it now?
What do you mean? How would I have
Like
handled it?
yeah.
I would
Do you
have
wish
gone
you
to
handled it differently, or do you think it's the
yeah,
same?
I wish at that time, if the if at that time, a lot of the HR, the way companies were set up with HR and what is it? The EOCC or the Equal Opportunity uh, Regulatory Group. Okay,
Mhm.
you know how right now you have to go through all this training. It
Right.
wasn't there before during my time, and so I still would feel uncomfortable. Now, if it was done now in this time, right now,
Uh-huh.
I would definitely go to HR and report this person.
I wonder
Okay.
if people would get away with that now. I don't think anyone could now, right? Like, well,
They still,
maybe.
because you have
Yeah.
solidarity of different types. You have either male solidarity or racial solidarity or sex. It's a different mindset. So it depends. They make it harder because that's why the EOCC, I think that's what it's called, is there so that if that company's HR department does not take action, you can go to them and report it, and they will investigate and take action if
Oh,
need
that's
be.
good.
Yeah, but that
Wow.
wasn't there, or it wasn't made. I wasn't made aware at that time.
But is there anything you wish you had said to him? Because that's
No.
what I play back in my mind. Like,
um, no, I was very proud of myself the way I handled it. I just looked at him and I just shook your head and I said, okay, good luck and thanks. And I just left. I felt I handled it quite well. And I
I
was
don't
very,
think he's open to feedback.
yeah, I don't think so either. But that's how I handled it. I wanted to be a better person and that's what I did. And I feel good about how I handled it. I didn't get angry at him. I didn't say nasty words to him. I was just like, okay, he's older than me. And
I would not have handled it that well.
I
I
was
would have
just like,
cried.
oh,
Oh,
I don't know.
you're
I'd
such
like
a
to.
strong woman.
but and actually empowered me to even
do more and better and have the other people who respected me like me more and irritate them more.
Oh,
That's what I do.
you don't feel like you could have went to those people and shared with them?
No, because there was this political structure that, it would have made it difficult for them, and they would have had to have sided with him.
Yeah.
I knew that, and that's why I left. And so, I what I did is in the middle. I was like, I'm gonna take my time. I'm gonna stay, do my best, and then look for other jobs. And then when I found one, I left.
No, I like to think that if I was in that situation, I'd
Uh-huh.
be like, oh, the gloves are off. You're going to say something completely inappropriate to me. Well, let me say something really inappropriate to you back.
April. April all of a sudden has a revenge fantasy about the guy that was mean to Iris.
I know. It's a science fiction thing. I'm going to jump in Iris's time machine, go back for her, really put the screws to that motherfucker.
Wow. So what happened was that there was a giant storm that came through, which is why it was so dark at April's house, and we all lost connectivity. And then we decided not to meet for a good 2 solid weeks. So now we're back to finish up the podcast, and we're going to just take off with things we didn't know or that surprised us while we were reading White Fragility, even though it's been, for some of us, at least 2 or 3 weeks since we've first read the book.
Well, I can tell you one of the things that surprised me was I didn't realize that white wasn't a thing until white people tried to exclude people. I didn't realize that the whole idea of white came to be, even as a legal definition, just so that you could exclude other people. That was the entire intention. You could apply to be white and probably pay a lot of money. And I think the book mentioned that that's what, the Armenians did, so that they could be legally classified as white and therefore take advantage of all of the legal benefits of being white, the privileges, you might say. And so if that is true, the idea of being white intrinsically means that white was better. And how can you have that as such an integral part of American society, so much so that it was a legal definition, and not think that it still is a part of American society today?
Yeah. I didn't know that either. And I remember thinking that it went back way far back in history, like that this was always the case. That people always felt that way.
Right. But it was like the 1600s.
But it wasn't. Yeah, because like when you watch the Doctor Who episodes and they go like way back in time, and sometimes his companion was a woman or sometimes his companion was African or black in color, and you would be like, oh no, what's going to happen to them? They can't possibly, something terrible is going to happen to them because they're black. And then nothing terrible happens to them. And you're like, oh, maybe it's just suspension of disbelief or whatever. But no, in fact, nothing would have happened to them. Like in Pompeii, it would have been fine. It's just in today's culture that we care. So was there anything in the book that you guys can remember that didn't resonate with you, that you were like, nope, that's not true, that's not it?
Definitely. But I know I need to process and research before I decide whether or not it truly wasn't valid, or just I resisted it because of my inherent racism.
What is it?
If you are supposed to call out people for being racist, right? That was a thing in the book, white solidarity, and that you should call other people out when they are being racist. And at least in the book's definition, other people, only white people can be racist. But if you take white people out of the equation, right, and it's, say, Asian people, Hispanic people, Black people, other people of color, can they be racist to each other?
Yeah.
And if they can be, am I supposed to call them out? Like if I'm with a Black friend, and I actually have been around Black friends. I remember going to a spin class with one of my Black friends, and she was talking about Asian people and like imitating their language, like, and I was like, what are you, you know? But then I didn't feel like I could, because who am I to say don't be racist because I'm white? So I mean, what is the role of white people in calling out other people of color for being racist against other people of color, or homophobic, or anything like that?
Yeah.
Because I'm white, do I lose all agency in calling out other races? I don't know.
That's a good question. I don't know. I know that doesn't feel right, especially if I'm in the room with someone and someone said something that makes someone that I love or care about uncomfortable. It would not feel right to not say something.
I think I definitely feel able to say something if someone was actively being hurt by what was being said. I don't even think I'd be able to stop it. But if it's private, if you're just in a car with someone and they're saying derogatory things about another group of people, I don't know. Can I not say, hey, girl, that's just as bad as white people saying shit about you?
I don't know that I would say it like that, but I mean, that, I want to say I don't know. I'm just talking now. I have no idea the answer. But B, if I was in that situation, the last thing that I would be like is that's racist or you shouldn't be racist. But I would be like, you know what? It makes me feel uncomfortable when you say or do things like that. So please just don't do that. I know, but can you just not do it around me? Like that's what I would. Because if does it make you feel uncomfortable?
Oh, yeah.
Then I mean, you just because you're a white person does not mean that you don't have the right to feel comfortable in a relationship with people. I don't think.
Well, I think you hit it when you said you don't necessarily have to use the term racist. You just say, I don't feel comfortable with you saying that, which I have before. I'm like, but I think
is that prejudice though? So can I ask you something? Now
Yeah.
you guys brought up an interesting point here. There's racism and then there's prejudice. Remember we were talking about definitions, and being prejudiced is an unfavorable opinion or feeling formed beforehand or without knowledge, thought, or reason. Any preconceived opinion or feeling, either favorable, unfavorable, unreasonable feelings, opinions, or attitude, especially of hostile nature regarding an ethnic, racial, social, or religious group. So how do you define that line between being racist and prejudice? Are they both
Well, I mean, if you're talking about in the context of this book, then it has to do with where the power is.
Right, exactly.
Anybody can be prejudiced, but to be racist, there has to be some power behind that.
The feeling of superiority.
Right. Or that can control someone else's,
right.
opportunities.
Yeah, I think
the influence.
I think she's right. I think what you're talking about isn't racism. What you're talking about is prejudice. It's being unkind. Like I'm just thinking, like if I were to say something that was racist or inappropriate, and Rob were to say to me, or you don't like it when people talk like that about women. Like I think that would be upsetting to me if he said it like that. But if he said to me, you say that and it makes me uncomfortable, or I don't think that that's very nice, my reaction is not going to immediately be defensive.
Well, but think of it. So when you're talking about the example where with Rob, and if he would say something about women, and
just hypothetical, he doesn't do this.
Right. Rob's totally amazing. But I could kind of see that if Nate going to the doctor or something, and I was like, oh, well, what did your doctor say? What did he say? And if Nate was to say, why do you assume he's a man? I probably would get a little defensive about that. Like, who are you as a man to call me, a woman, sexist, right? And I would get a little bit, don't mansplain to me,
Yeah.
And so I think that as white people, we have to be careful of that. Even if that's not where our intention is, we can come across as being condescending, like we're so much more aware about appropriate behavior, and you're trying to teach someone who lives it every day.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? That's
I
where
do.
it's a delicate thing.
That's
But I think you hit it, Michelle, when you were like, you don't have to label it anything. All you have to do is just say, that makes me uncomfortable.
Agreed. Yeah.
The only thing about the book that bothered me a little bit was the obvious way that I felt like she was manipulating me. Like, I just felt very manipulated through the whole book, and I, leaned into it a little. But otherwise, I thought it was good. I didn't have anything else.
Well, what I think is important is that this was, for me anyway, which is why I wanted you guys to read it too. It was the jumping off point. And, obviously the thunderstorm came in and interrupted the podcast, and I continued to do research. And when I first was into it, I was in it, and I was like, you guys have to, this is some truth being spun out. Y'all gotta get in on this. And of course now I've, continued to read other voices, and, it's put it into perspective a little bit. In fact, Nate, of course I was all about, Nate, we need to recognize our privilege, and we need, and which Nate gets it, but he's not quite as needing to make amends like I feel like I have to. Nate's like, this is what it is. I didn't have anything to do with it. I recognize that that's what it is, and I don't want to contribute to it, but I don't necessarily feel like I need to bend over backwards to accommodate shit that I didn't even really contribute. So he gave me this YouTube video, and it was two African-American guys discussing White Fragility, and not necessarily the book, but the principle. And it was an interesting thing, because they definitely see white people who are doing all the things that we're supposed to do. We're listening to Black voices, and we're being quiet, and instead of trying to take the stage, share the Black perspective, and Black, the whole thing about white people can't be racist. They addressed that, and that was probably the first wake up for me, is because they were talking about listening to white people say that sort of thing. They definitely see it as virtue signaling.
Yeah.
They 100% see it as not genuine, insincere, just saying, the talking points to make it seem like you're woke. And I agree. I mean, when I think about the Black people, which I've talked about before, I'm definitely not as close to as many Black people as I was when I was younger, and we all went to school together. But when I think about the Black people that I'm closest to and the conversations that we have, if I were to say some shit like that, they would look at me like, this ain't real, I think what it came down to for me was, this book was a jumping off point. It doesn't teach you about race relations. It doesn't talk to you about how to form real relationships with diverse people. What it does is teach you to confront your own inherent beliefs and your own triggers that would prevent you from recognizing where you need to improve. So for that purpose, I think the book was useful. But it's definitely not read this book, give yourselves a thumbs up, and carry on with your life. It's an avenue to bigger things.
Cool. I think we should talk about, how did you guys read it, listen to it? What did you do?
I listened to it.
Tried to order it because I felt like, especially in the initial throes of I've got to, wake myself up, is like, well, look at my, not only is there not enough diversity in my friend group, but is there enough diversity on my bookshelves? And so I was like, I'm going to buy this book and I'll put it on my shelf, and somehow that'll make me a better person. So I was going to buy the book. And it's on back order, which is great. That's a great thing. That means a lot of people are interested. But because it was on back order, I got the Kindle version. And I have to say, there were definite advantages to the Kindle version. Oh. I did not listen to the audiobook, so I can't speak on that. But one of the cool things about the Kindle version is whenever there was a reference, like a footnote or something that was going to back up the author's point, it was a hyperlink. So you could click on it and it would automatically take you to other articles and other sources. You wouldn't get that in any other format. So, and I think the Kindle version was pretty cool for that.
You also did Kindle, Iris?
I got both the audio and the Kindle.
So tried. Did you do the Audible audio or did you do like the Kindle?
Audible.
Okay.
I just could not read it.
So what was the narrator? Did the author narrate her own book or?
No. Oh no! Oh my gosh, that was the best part. So the narrator.
It was narrated by an otter.
An otter, yeah. It was crazy. This mammal was just out of control. No, the narrator is the same narrator that did the Three Dark Crown series. Which I don't know if you guys read this series, but I listened to it, and it's an amazing series. And in the series, it's basically about these three women who all want to be queens, and then they try to kill each other through the next 8 books. So that's her voice. So immediately when she starts talking, I'm transported into this world because I've listened to like 6 of these books, right? So I'm hearing her talk about this, and it starts off, and it kind of was kind of cool in that listening to her voice, I was like, oh, this is talking to me about another land. This isn't where I live. This is somewhere else. Like I was able to disassociate myself for a time from the book because I like associated this author with this other terrible world that she had, or this narrator that she had narrated these other books. She's actually narrated a lot of things, and she's a very good narrator, I thought. After it only took me maybe 4 or 5 minutes, and then I was listening to her like normal, but
it was hard to separate it from fiction.
In the beginning, I was like, "Oh, what world are we in?
What's about to happen?"
Her voice draws you in, like into another world. Yeah.
Had you ever heard the narrator before, Iris?
No.
Amy Landon, that's her name. She did a lot of racism books.
Oh, really?
I'm just looking in Audible right now. She read a lot of them. But I have her in my library for the...
I had a neutral reaction from her. My son had a negative reaction from her, so...
Oh. After a while, it felt like her voice was the voice of the author. For me.
Yeah, well, Iris, you listened to some interviews with the author, right?
Yes, I did.
How?
Yeah, that was suspected sort of face that you're making. How was that?
I don't know. I'm not.
She's like, I don't know. Descriptions.
I'm happy. I listened. I made sure those links I sent you. I didn't want to get swayed, so I wanted to listen to the book first before. And I'm happy I did because then I would have had a negative reaction to the book.
Oh. Yeah, I'm not a fan of self-help either. Maybe that's what I was sensing also. But I'm glad that I read it. I appreciate this project.
Yeah, that book brought a lot of emotion, and I guess it did what it was supposed to do. Yeah, it did.
Cool. All right, so overall, I think it was a great discussion. I feel terrible about myself, so the book has done its work. And there's jumping off forums to go to. There's things we can do in the future, and I think April's right. We need to read more about it, and we need to practice it, and just be as best humans as we can, right? Yeah. All right, so with that, I guess we'll sign out. What should we have our sign-off be today? I mean, it can't be eat the book, motherfucker. Or can it?
Well, I think it can because it doesn't need to be the end. This needs to be the beginning. So, eat the books, motherfucker.
I love April's expression. Yes.